I watched her lips curl as she called me a hypocrite, and in that heartbeat, I knew my entire life was about to come crashing down. I never thought a simple text thread could betray me. I sat at the edge of my seat in that packed courtroom, feeling the lights bore into my skin. I could almost hear the echo of her, nothing but a liar. I remember my heart pounding so loud I feared the judge might hear it. Then she smiled as if she'd won. Then the prosecutor leaned forward, voice cold. Then the gallery hushed. I glanced at my roommate, seated 3 rows back, her hands gripping a stack of phone printouts. Then doubt crept in. Had I really been so careless? I could taste the metallic tang of fear in my mouth. I could feel my sweat-damp shirt clinging to my chest. I could see my lawyer fidgeting with his pen, eyes flicking between me and the opposing table. I wondered if anyone believed me when I said those texts had been altered. I wondered if truth mattered anymore. I wondered if I was already too late. What happens when the evidence you need comes from the one person you never thought would betray you? I remember the morning light spilling through my kitchen window as if nothing ominous could ever intrude. I remember the soft hum of the coffee maker as it filled my mug with warmth. I remember the gentle creak of the floorboards when I padded down the hallway to wake my daughter. I'm Alex Mendoza. I'm a freelance graphic designer. I'm a single parent with a 6-year-old daughter named Maya, whose laughter was the soundtrack of my life. I'm the son of 2 schoolteachers who taught me that honesty was sacred. I'm the brother of a police officer who once told me, "The truth is the sharpest weapon you'll ever wield." I woke up every day at 5:45 a.m. to Maya's sleepy whisper, "Daddy, can we make pancakes?" Then I flipped on our old radio, smooth just drifting through our tiny apartment in downtown Portland. Then I smiled as Maya poured batter onto the griddle, flour dusting her nose like fresh snow. I walked Maya to her elementary school each morning, my tie undone, my sneakers scuffed, because I liked the way she thought I looked casual. I walked past the corner bakery where Mrs. Patel always waved from behind the counter. I walked under the elm trees that line 12th Street, their branches sketching patterns on the sidewalk. I spent my days designing logos and websites from a cramped desk in my living room. I spent my afternoons rescuing runaway cats for my volunteer work at the Humane Society. I spent my evenings helping Maya with her homework, spelling tests, multiplication tables, art projects that always ended with glitter on the coffee table. I believed I had it all figured out. I believed my life was a perfect little routine, anchored by love and the steady pulse of normalcy. I believed that no matter how wild the world got, I had my priorities straight. Protect Maya, honor my parents' lessons, stay true to myself. Then April 12th happened. Then I opened my inbox to an email with the subject line, "Custody hearing next week." Then I read words that froze my soul. "Your ex-spouse has filed for full custody, citing evidence of irresponsible parenting." Then I saw the attachments. Screenshots from a text conversation. Then I saw her message. "You don't even care about Maya. You're too busy chasing clients." I remember my hands trembling so violently I dropped my coffee mug. I remember the acrid smell of burnt latte as it pooled on my keyboard. I remember Maya's voice calling, "Daddy, are you okay?" And the panic in her eyes when she saw the spilled coffee. I remember dialing my sister, Lisa, at the precinct, her calm voice on the other end. "Breathe, Alex. We'll find out who sent those texts." I remember her promise. "I'll run digital forensics tonight." I remember thinking, I wish I could be her hero, but right now I'm the one in the dock. I remember the nights that followed in a blur. I remember pacing our living room at 2 a.m., phone in hand, refreshing my email. I remember Maya sleeping on the couch in her unicorn pajamas, clutching her stuffed rabbit. I remember whispering to her, "We'll be okay, sweet girl," even though I wasn't sure. I remember my apartment feeling colder. I remember the shadows on the walls stretching into menacing shapes. I remember the silence of my laptop keys as I stared at my empty inbox. I remember the dread settling in my chest like a stone. I remember my lawyer, Mrs. Hathaway, arriving with a stack of documents and a stern look. I remember her voice low and serious. "They've accused you of missing curfews, exposing Maya to unsafe environments, and these texts are the centerpiece." I remember her tapping the printouts. I remember the sight of my own phone screen distorted, messages I never typed. I remember the walls of the courtroom on that first day, pale gray, cold marble floors, fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. I remember my heart in my throat as I introduced myself. Alex Mendoza, father, designer, lover of my daughter. I remember the judge's gaze, sharp and unblinking. I remember feeling as though I were under a microscope, every choice I'd ever made laid bare. I remember the prosecutor's voice slicing through the air. Mr. Mendoza, these texts tell a different story. Would you care to explain? I remember swallowing against the lump in my throat. I remember the world tilting on its axis. I remember the moment I realized nothing would ever be the same. I remember praying that the truth would matter. I remember wishing I had an ally, someone who could prove that those messages were fabricated. What happens when the person you trusted with your life becomes the source of your greatest threat? I remember the first time I noticed the change. I remember Maya's school called me about a missed pickup. Mr. Mendoza, your daughter has been waiting for nearly an hour. Then I rushed out of a client meeting, papers scattering like startled birds. Then I heard her voice at the door. Daddy, you're late again. I remember her disappointment cutting deeper than any courtroom accusation. I remember the look on my roommate, Jenna's, face when I burst into our apartment, her eyes narrowing as she said, "You really need to get your act together." Then I laughed it off, thinking she was joking. I remember thinking I was strong. I remember believing I could juggle deadlines and diapers without dropping either. I remember the tiny voice in my head whispering, "You're failing." I remember the atmosphere in the courtroom thickening. I remember the prosecutor flipping through my personal diary, reading aloud, "Is this really the life a father should lead?" I remember my cheeks burning. I remember then receiving a text from my ex-spouse. "You missed another appointment. Are you even capable of caring for Maya?" I remember my throat closing. I remember staring at words I couldn't delete fast enough. I remember then Jenna pulling me aside in the kitchen. I remember her voice low. "Alex, I found these texts saved in your drafts. Why would you draft something calling you irresponsible?" I remember my pulse spiking. I remember my breath catching in my chest. I remember thinking, she's protecting me. I remember thinking, she's gaslighting me to doubt myself. I remember thinking, I'm losing my mind. I remember then sitting in my car late at night, shaking so hard I couldn't grip the steering wheel. I remember calling my sister, voice trembling, "Lisa, they're controlling the narrative." I remember her promise, calm and fierce. "I'll get your phone records, I'll clear your name." I remember then waking up to a voicemail from Maya's teacher. "We need to talk about your daughter's social withdrawal." I remember shoving my phone away. I remember pacing our living room. I remember the walls closing in. I remember then during mediation, the mediator asking, "Why do you think your ex is making these allegations?" I remember my lawyer's whisper, "Stick to the facts." I remember swallowing and saying, "Because she wants full custody." I remember the mediator's pen scratching across the paper. I remember feeling the air grow colder. I remember then Jenna bringing me lunch to the courthouse cafeteria. I remember her handing me a sandwich with no mayo. "You said you hated mayo." I remember that small kindness and the suspicion in her eyes. I remember thinking, "What are you hiding?" I remember then noticing small criticisms. "You're too emotional," the judge's clerk murmured when I couldn't hold back tears. "You can't handle pressure," the prosecutor sneered when I asked a follow-up question. "You act like a child," my ex's lawyer spat when I defended my decisions. I remember the criticism seeping into my bones. I remember feeling corners of my mind whisper, "Maybe they're right." I remember then the gaslighting moments. I remember the text thread that Jenna found vanishing from my drafts folder the next day. I remember the key evidence on my laptop mysteriously corrupted. I remember the email drafts deleted from my sent folder. I remember then the realization hitting me. This is orchestrated. I remember feeling a flicker of anger, raw and incandescent, burning away the doubt. I remember then a quiet control tightening around me, like strings around a marionette. I remember every move I made being logged, analyzed, weaponized. I remember my ex's legal team forwarding private messages with altered timestamps. I remember the world shrinking down to cold text on a screen. I remember then the night I confronted Jenna in the hallway. I remember my voice firm for the first time. What aren't you telling me? I remember her fidgeting with her keys. I remember her eyes darting. I remember her whisper. I didn't want you to worry. I remember her handing me a flash drive. I remember my pulse hammering. I remember then taking that drive home, my hands shaking as I plugged it in. I remember watching file after file appear, deleted drafts, metadata logs, screenshots with original timestamps intact. I remember my breath catching as I realized I'd been given the truth. I remember then the swell of hope, like the first light of dawn after a soul-crushing night. I remember thinking, this is it. I remember thinking, this is my chance. I remember then crawling into bed beside Maya, sweet in her innocence, unaware of the battle raging for her future. I remember stroking her hair and whispering, Daddy's going to fix this. What happens when your closest ally risks everything to arm you with the evidence you desperately need? I remember the day everything shattered. I remember Maya tugging at my sleeve, eyes wide. Daddy, why is the judge frowning at me? I remember glancing down, seeing her small frame slumped in the witness chair, trembling under the courtroom glare. Then my stomach twisted. I remember the moment the prosecutor played a recording of Maya's whispered answer, her voice clipped, shaken. I don't want to live with Daddy anymore. I remember my breath catching as that searing sentence echoed through the hushed chamber. Then time slowed. Then my heart stopped. I remember the judge's gavel coming down like thunder. Then my world crumbled. Then I saw my ex-spouse's triumphant smile as though she just dealt the final blow. I remember sprinting out of the gallery, every footstep a drumbeat of panic. I remember bursting into the hallway, vaulting over a bench, straining to catch my breath. Then I sank to the floor, head in my hands. What just happened? I remember my lawyer finding me, crouching beside me, her voice urgent. Alex, your ex coached Maya. That recording is inadmissible if we can prove it. I remember looking up at her, tears blurring the fluorescent lights. I remember whispering, she lied. I remember the crash of betrayal in my chest. I remember realizing that my ex had weaponized our own daughter. I remember feeling a spine-tingling dread. She'll do anything to win. I remember charging back into the courtroom. I remember slamming the flash drive on the prosecutor's table. I remember my lawyer's proud nod as she said, Your Honor, we have new evidence to submit. Then the courtroom buzzed. Then the judge raised an eyebrow. I remember my pulse pounding as we rehashed the timeline. How the recording was edited, Maya coached between breaks, how every intonation was manipulated. I remember my voice quivering as I recounted Maya's tearful confession afterward. Daddy, I'm sorry, I said those things. Then I squeezed her photo in my hand. I remember then the prosecutor's eyes narrowing. I remember the hush as he realized his linchpin had been severed. I remember the judge's pen tapping, deliberating. I remember the weight of every second stretching into an eternity. I remember Maya's face, pale but hopeful in the witness gallery. I remember Jenna's hand on my shoulder, a silent pillar of strength. I remember thinking, I can't lose her. Not now, not ever. I remember the breaking point, my voice cracking as I addressed the court. Your Honor, I refuse to let my daughter's love be a pawn in this game. I built my life around her laughter, her trust. You will not let this lie dictate our future. Then tears welled in my eyes. I remember the judge leaning forward, gaze softening. I remember him saying, Mr. Mendoza, we will review this evidence thoroughly. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. Then the gavel fell again, slower this time, as if granting a moment's reprieve. I remember staggering out of the courtroom into the dim hallway, leaning against the cold wall. I remember surrendering to sobs I'd held back since this nightmare began. I remember Jenna wrapping her arms around me. I remember her whisper, You did everything right. I remember driving home that night, headlights cutting through the rain. I remember Maya asleep in the backseat, clutching her blanket. I remember praying to whatever power listened that tomorrow would bring justice. I remember sitting in the empty kitchen, flashing on every memory of Maya's first steps, her first word. I remember vowing, I will not fail her now. I remember the dread of waiting overnight for a decision that could rip my daughter from my arms. I remember the restless hours, the blinking cursor on my laptop, the endless hum of the refrigerator. Then I dozed, haunted by images of Maya's tear-streaked face. I remember waking at dawn, heart pounding like a drum roll. I remember dressing in my best shirt and tie, smoothing my hair with trembling fingers. I remember looking in the mirror, seeing fear etched under my eyes and determination blazing in my chest. What happens when your child's voice is used against you, and the only thing standing between you and losing everything is a shred of truth? I remember the hush as the courtroom doors swung open. I remember every eye turning toward the door. Then I saw her, Jenna, walking down the aisle, clutching a slim binder. Then a ripple of surprise spread across the gallery. Then the judge raised his gavel, ready to call the court to order. I remember my throat tightening as Jenna reached the witness stand. I remember her voice steady as she said, "Your Honor, I have the unedited text logs and metadata from Mr. Mendoza's phone." Then she handed the binder to my lawyer. Then I felt the air shift, like a storm breaking. I remember the prosecutor's face paling as he flipped through page after page, timestamps, IP addresses, raw drafts never sent. I remember Jenna's quiet testimony. I extracted these files the night I found the flash drive. They proved the texts were altered on a secondary device. Then she produced the original SMS thread, unmodified. Then she clicked play on the audio file of Maya's true testimony, her voice clear, uncoached. "I love living with Daddy." I remember the courtroom's collective gasp. I remember the judge leaning forward, eyes locked on Jenna. I remember the prosecution's objection. "Your Honor, this evidence is circumstantial." And Jenna's calm reply. "With the metadata logs, each entry shows the edits were made off-site, not from Mr. Mendoza's device." I remember my pulse thunderous as the judge called for a recess. I remember retreating to the hallway with my lawyer and Jenna. I remember knees shaking, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear my lawyer's whisper. "You've just delivered the knockout blow." Then she smiled. Then I allowed myself a fleeting breath. I remember returning to the courtroom, every sense heightened. I remember Jenna taking her seat, eyes meeting mine for a moment, her nod a tether to reality. I remember the prosecutor's closing argument faltering, stumbling over the newly revealed facts. I remember my lawyer seizing the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence speaks for itself. Mr. Mendoza's character has been attacked, his daughter's testimony manipulated, all to tilt the scales of justice." I remember then the judge's summation, his voice measured, grave. After reviewing the unedited logs and testimony, the court finds that the text messages and recording were altered and coached. The accusations against Mr. Mendoza are hereby dismissed. Then the gavel sank like a heartbeat echo. I remember the silence that followed, as if the world itself were catching its breath. Then the gallery erupted in murmurs, some relieved, others astonished. Then I closed my eyes, tears slipping down my cheeks. Then I exhaled the tension I'd carried for months. I remember stepping down from the stand, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat of triumph. I remember Jenna meeting me halfway, wrapping me in a tight embrace. Then I felt the warmth of relief and gratitude flooding through me. Then I whispered, "You saved me." I remember walking out of the courtroom, sunlight blinding after weeks of fluorescent glare. I remember lifting Maya into my arms, her small arms winding around my neck. Then she whispered, "Daddy, you did it." Then I kissed her forehead, tasting tears of joy. I remember my lawyer turning to me with a grin. "Case closed permanently." Then I laughed, the sound harsh with emotion. Then I realized how much I'd missed freedom, from fear, from doubt, from the threat of losing Maya. I remember my parents hugging me in the hallway, my mother's tears wet on my shoulder, my father's proud grip on my arm. Then I told them about the binder, the metadata, the uncoached audio. Then my sister, in uniform, saluted me with a smirk. "Welcome back to the land of the innocent." I remember driving home that afternoon, Maya asleep in her car seat, head against the window. I remember pulling into our driveway, breathing in the scent of jasmine from our front garden. Then I carried Maya inside, her unicorn blanket trailing behind. Then I tucked her into bed, her eyes fluttering closed. I remember sitting in the dark living room afterward, the courtroom victory replaying in my mind like a film reel. I remember the shimmer of moonlight on the coffee table, the faint creak of the radiator. Then I closed my eyes, savoring the moment when truth finally pierced through lies. I remember thinking, we survived. We prevailed. And now we can truly begin again. I remember the judge's final words still ringing in my ears as I stepped out into the bright corridor. This court finds in favor of Mr. Mendoza. Primary custody remains with the father. I remember the gavel's echo reverberating through my chest, shaking loose months of fear. Then I closed my eyes, letting relief wash over me like warm rain. I remember my lawyer's hand on my shoulder as she whispered, "You're free to go." I remember the weight lifting from my spine, nodding into tears I didn't know I'd held back. Then I exhaled, whole and deep. Then I heard my own voice, trembling. "Thank you." I remember reassembling my family in the hallway, Jenna, my sister Lisa in uniform, my parents beaming like sunrise. Then I felt Maya slip into my arms, her face flush with excitement. Then she whispered, "Daddy, I knew you'd win." Then I kissed the top of her head, tasting sweet victory. I remember walking out of the courthouse doors into the late afternoon sun. Then I felt each ray as a promise. Promise of safety, promise of stability, promise of truth prevailing. Then I paused to breathe in the scent of spring blossoms drifting from the planters. Then I realized I was smiling without restraint for the first time in months. I remember the drive home, windows down, wind tousling my hair. Then Maya sang along to her favorite song on the radio, voice clear and bright. Then I reached over to hold her hand as I steered. Then I felt tears of gratitude slipping down my cheeks. I kept my promise. I remember arriving at our apartment to find it transformed, balloons tied to our mailbox, a "Congratulations, Alex and Maya" banner strung across our front door. Then Jenna emerged from around the corner with pizza boxes and cupcakes. Then my parents popped out from behind her, laughter and applause greeting me like a hero's welcome. I remember tossing my briefcase aside and scooping Maya into a spin. Then she shrieked with delight as I twirled her under the banner. Then I felt Jenna's hand on my back, steady and proud. Then I caught my mother's tears in the cupcake frosting. This is home. I remember settling onto our couch that evening, family clustered around pizza and soda. Then I listened as Maya recounted every detail from the courtroom, the audio tapes, Jenna's testimony, the judge's gavel. Then I ruffled her hair and said, "You were so brave." Then she grinned, frosting at the corners of her mouth. I remember later, after bedtime stories, tucking Maya in and whispering, "We did it, sweet girl." Then I stroked her hair as she drifted off, chest rising and falling in peaceful sleep. Then I sat by her bed, watching the rise and fall of her eyelashes. This is why I fought. I remember drifting downstairs to our living room and collapsing into the armchair. Then I closed my eyes against the glare of the reading lamp. Then I felt Jenna slip in beside me, handing me a steaming cup of tea. Then she sat close, shoulder brushing mine. Then I said softly, "I don't know how I'd have done this without you." Then she shrugged, smile quiet. "You gave me the truth to work with." I remember finally feeling the tremor in my hands fade, fingers unclenching from their months-long grip. Then I felt my breath slow, tension ebbing out through every pore. Then I allowed myself to imagine our life moving forward. Maya's bedtime laughter, weekend pancake breakfasts, quiet nights of sketching by lamplight. Normalcy felt both fragile and precious. I remember thinking about the courtroom's oppressive lights, the judge's stern gaze, the sharp sting of betrayal. Then I realized how far we'd come, from that first text that almost destroyed us to the moment the truth set us free. Then I felt a gratitude so vast it nearly overwhelmed me. I remember glancing at the clock, 11:47 p.m., and realizing how late it was. Then I rose, stretched stiff limbs, and flicked off the lamp. Then I stood in the darkened living room, ears attuned to the distant hum of the city. Then I whispered into the empty air, "We're safe now." I remember the final shiver of fear leaving me. Then I allowed a smile to touch my lips. Then I looked ahead to tomorrow, school drop-off, client calls, volunteer shift at the Humane Society. Then I realized those routines would feel like triumphs now. Every normal moment was a gift. I remember the day's battles slipping behind me, replaced by hope for the days to come. Then I wondered quietly, what happens when the verdict is behind you and you get to write your own story? I remember the tremor in my chest as I replayed every moment, the terror, the betrayal, the triumph. I remember how truth had felt like a fragile flame in a storm, yet it burned brighter than any lie. I remember thinking, I almost lost everything because someone twisted the story. I believe now more than ever. I believe that honesty is our fiercest armor. I believe that when you stand firm in truth, you give others permission to do the same. I believe that no matter how powerful the opposition, a single spark of genuine evidence can ignite justice. I know that life will still test me. I know that storms will come again, unexpected emails, half-truths whispered in hallways, doubts whispered in my own mind. I know now that I'll face them with eyes wide open, heart steady, and the fierce knowledge that truth doesn't need permission. If you've ever felt powerless in the face of lies, if you've ever watched someone weaponize your own words against you, if you believe in the fierce power of authentic testimony, I invite you to join this community. I invite you to share your story below, because your voice matters. I invite you to hit that like button if you believe that truth, no matter how buried, will always find a way to the surface. I invite you to subscribe for more courtroom confessions, more tales of resilience, and proof that no lie is strong enough to silence the honest heart. I promise you, when you stand up, speak out, and demand the real story, you become unstoppable. I'm Alex Mendoza, and this confession is proof that truth doesn't need an invitation to fight back. Like, comment, subscribe,